Hello, welcome back to our reading of Hegel's Lectures on the History of Philosophy. And last time we actually talked about the question of relativism. And I just want to quickly summarize my position on that and then get back to Hegel's position on the truth. Now, why is that important? Because many people believe that once you're a relativist, you have kicked out truth. Truth is not on board anymore. And I also believe that they have a wrong understanding of relativism. And under these circumstances, I believe it is wrong to read Hegel. I believe he's a relativist. Now, see, this is a controversial position. There are many people who put the logic, the science of logic, into the center of Hegel's philosophy. And they say, even though the historical circumstances and moral laws that we follow and so on and so forth, they are relativist, doesn't mean that we cannot know the fundamental laws of how different positions develop. And they follow according to the logical laws, to the logical movement of the concept. Now, I believe the concept is a very powerful notion that we have nowadays, but it's not the internal machine of the universe. And I also believe that Hegel does not believe that. But as I said, that's a very controversial view. Now, what is my relativism about? So we often have this argument, what do you mean truth is relative? That's an absolute statement, genius. So this is called a performative contradiction because, see, we have here the sentence truth is relative and it's embedded in a performance. And the performance is, I claim that it is true that there's no truth, for example, or that truth is relative. And at that moment, my performance and the content of my performance, which is the statement, they contradict each other. And we don't want to commit such a performative contradiction because building something on contradiction is usually not that good. It leads to the formal explosion of the systems we employ, or that's usually assumed. Even there are philosophers such as Priest who believe that if you introduce a contradiction into a system, it does not necessarily explode. But let's not dive into that. I think we should avoid the performative contradiction. And see, I believe a genuine relativism doesn't do that. So why is that? Because I don't claim that there is no truth. I just say the following. So far, nobody has presented to me convincing evidence, and I have studied the philosophies and the sciences a lot, but nobody has presented to me convincing evidence that we can say for 100% certainty what mind-independent reality is and how we relate to it. And as long as I cannot be 100% certain, I won't commit entirely to this paradigm. Now, I'm very committed to the sciences of nature, but sometimes I feel they lean themselves a bit too far out of the window when, for example, they claim that our mind are just physical reactions and biological processes. Now, hear me out. I'm not saying that there are not physical reactions and biological processes, but I also don't say they are. I'm relativist about it. Why? Because I claim we don't know yet. And as long as we don't know, we should find a way of working with both positions. Very similar argument for the existence of God. Now, I don't know whether God exists or not. I don't know. Nobody has presented to my mind convincing evidence. Therefore, I neither say that God exists nor that he does not exist. And I believe on such a relativism, I have to build a position. And we can discuss which position is more reasonable. Should we maybe build a position where we rather assume that God exists or that he does not exist? Okay, but like putting absolute certain knowledge at the base of our convictions especially about mind-independent reality, I find that a bit complicated. And I say, let's commit to the second best scientific theory, which is relativism. And I claim that even most of the sciences are relativists. Why? Because they see they're so-called empirical realisms. And an empirical realism can be a relativism. What is not a relativism is a metaphysical realism, where I claim I know what metaphysical reality really is about. Empirical realism says I have experiences, you have experiences, we experience common things, we can agree on our experiences, and on the base of these experiences we can build theories. And if there is an experience that contradicts our former experiences, then we can agree with further processes that we use, whether we integrate that experience into our theory, whether we test it again, and whether we maybe progress or whether we debate that experience, and so on and so forth. But this is an empirical realism, and it's basically built on the framework that I say, as long as I can form a coherent picture from my experiences, it's reasonable to go in that direction. I don't see that there is another good theory for that. And every scientist says, yeah, if you come with good experiments that contradict my theory, I will change my position. That's a relativism. So, and therefore, I just say we always have like this here, the scumbag analytic philosopher. Analytic philosophers are, for more continental philosophers, always the straw man that they want to kill. I may be also sometimes unfair with regard to their positions, maybe because I don't know the tradition that well enough. I've studied it, but I don't claim that I'm an expert in it. Also for Hegel, I don't see myself as an expert. But here it says, and they make it very simple, believes in the universal truth of moral relativism. So universal and relativism. This is here like contrasted, and these people, they say, he's such a moron, like a scumbag analytic philosopher. And who's arrogant in that situation? Maybe this guy is an annoying dude because he defends a relativism which just says, anything goes. Like, yeah, maybe 2 plus 2 is 4. Maybe it's 5, maybe it's 6, just depends on the perspective. Okay. There are positions that I would say are not reasonable relativisms. I agree with that. But we shouldn't make it too easy for fundamentally reject relativism with such a kind of arrogance. I hope you understand what I mean. And I just want to say the argument of performative contradiction or self-contradiction is known for so many years. I think Apel came up with that in the 80s, maybe even earlier. So it's already known for so many years. Like, what do you think? Like, the relativists, they just ignore it and they say, oh yeah, I heard of that argument. No, they know about that. It's quite simple and they study it. And they will have arguments against these arguments. So, and we have to at least know what they respond. It's maybe not that simple, okay? So we shouldn't be arrogant. I also shouldn't be arrogant. That's sometimes very hard. And make it very simple. Okay. But yeah, this is the question. Are you religious? I'm a religious relativist. I read the phenomenology of spirit as a relativism, which is odd in a sense. Okay, let's finish here and let's come back to our lecture. And yeah, it's sometimes a bit hard to read Hegel as a relativist. As Walter Jeschke has actually found out, we are reading here lectures that are written after the notes of Hegel. And the right-wing Hegelians who managed these documents, they actually destroyed a lot of documents that were not in line with the belief that Hegel is hinting towards a theory of religion and God, which were basically the right-wing Hegelians. Therefore, I'm always a bit skeptical about these notes, but we read them in the spirit of Hegel. But my argument is always when I read something that pushes too much into the direction or against relativism, I say, oh, it's probably because there are notes. But so far, I think every passage can be easily or can still be read in the spirit of the relativism or the relativist interpretation of Hegel that I actually suggest. So the above statement that the truth is only one is still abstract and formal. Okay, so Hegel is one of the philosophers who believes that there is oneness, at least an ideal oneness, and if there is truth, it must be one truth, it cannot be many. Now, this view is also debated. I don't agree with the people who say there are multiple truths. If there is truth, then there's only one, and our aim is to seek for this truth. I'm not saying that we easily get this truth, but I think the aim of a genuine philosopher, I would make that argument, is to search for this truth. But as he says here, even though we formulate that, that's still abstract and formal. Okay? This is like when I tell you, like the fundamental law of logic is A equals A, and it's not true that A and not A at the same time, which is the principle of contradiction. We have like these are the two fundamental laws of logic from which we can derive all other laws. So, but even though I state them, they're still abstract and formal because what do they mean, right? And if you look at A equals A, it's even absurd in its abstraction because it formulates there are two A's, and then what? Like, how can two A's be identical? So shouldn't we just write A? Yeah, but this is related to the fact that they are still abstract and we have to explain them, okay? So in the deeper sense, it is our starting point. Okay, it's our starting point, and then we try to dive into and to develop it. But the aim of philosophy is to know this one truth as the immediate source from which all else proceeds. Both all the laws of nature and all manifestations of life and consciousness, of which there are mere rejections, or to lead these laws and manifestations in ways apparently contrary back to that single source, and from that source to comprehend them, which is to understand their derivation. So I think the sentence is pretty self-explanatory. I just want to say it's the aim of philosophy, okay, to lead everything back to the abstract source, the idea that truth is one. And if we think about physics, where we have the quantum laws and the laws of gravitation or relativity, I'm not a physicist, okay? But there we also usually talk about a theory that is one, which is our aim. But that does not mean that without this truth, our theories don't work. We can still work. We can still do practical things with it. But it would be great if we had the law for everything, right? And that's also the aim of philosophy, even transcending, by the way, the limits of physics. That's why it's called metaphysics. It's not just restricted to the empirical. Thus, what is most essential to know is to know that the single truth is not merely a solitary, empty thought, but one determined within itself. What does he mean by that? So, okay, I'm not entirely sure, so I just look in the sentence. What is it? So, what is the main utterance? The single truth is not merely solitary. I have to look up this word. I think solitary means just one, right? Let me look it up for a second. This is like sometimes where my English knowledge comes to its limits. Solitary, like one and alone, right? So yeah, one and alone. Maybe we can also say finished. Maybe we could say finished. So it's not like, yeah, maybe this is the best one. So the single truth does not just stand for itself alone, like an empty thought, like A equals A. Take that, moron. I like this word. But one determined within itself. And then, yeah, okay, it's not alone, but it's determined within itself. So what does that might mean? It is not undeterminate. It's determined, but within itself. So there's more in itself. It's not a truth that is alone, but that maybe consists of many truths inside of it, but that brings them all together so that it is one. Maybe that's the thesis. So let's keep that in mind and follow and see what else he has to say. To obtain this knowledge, we must enter into some abstract notion, which, as such are quite general and dry, and which are the two principles of development and of the concrete. Now, forgive me that I don't know which principles he means, but he says, okay, we have to start with an abstract thought, which may be boring. I hope I don't bore you, but it may be boring, right? So yeah, this is all clear what he says here, right? I mean, it's not clear what he indicates, but the way he leads us into the thought should be clear. We could indeed embrace the whole in the single principle of development. Now, what is the principle of development? I guess everything in the universe develops from A to not A, maybe something like that. Let's just take that as a hypothesis. If this were clear, all else would result and follow of its own accord. So if only the principle of development would be there, then everything would just develop for itself. Like the tree would just grow for itself, the planet would just evolve for themselves. But what Hegel usually defends is that there is a theory of oneness, which we call holism. Everything is a whole, okay? And so in that sense, everything is somehow related, but of course we have to figure out how it is related. The product of thinking is thought. Okay, when we think, we get thoughts, that's clear. Thought is, however, still formal. So thought is not yet related to practice. We just think it in our heads. And in that way, it's formal. Somewhat more defined, it becomes notion. So if we really think something and then we determine it any further by our thinking process, then it becomes what Hegel would call a concept, and which often is translated as a notion, but I suggest that concept is the better word instead of notion, okay? And finally, idea is thought in its totality. So yeah, this is a going back to, I believe, a theory of Kant, maybe borrowed from another philosopher, but I know it from Kant. We always start with sensations. That's also in Aristotle very similar. Then on the basis of sensations, we sense the world. We get intuitions like, oh, that's like we reproduce it somehow in our mind, and then we produce it when we close our eyes. So for example, we sense an object, take it together, then we reproduce it, produce it in our mind, and then we bring it to the concept, okay? And the concept for Kant is based on categories, I believe 12 categories, which means that everything, I think, must be thought as having a substance, as being in relation to each other. So there are 12 categories. Let me not summarize them. I also doubt that I get them all together. Quality, quantity, relation. I've forgotten. So, and yeah, but for Hegel anyway, like these 12 categories are already different. But yeah, when we think it together with categories, by virtue of categories, we apply a formal thought in order to think it, right? But it's not yet clear what it is. But when we ask, what are these thoughts that we actually have based on, then we get to so-called ideas. For example, the idea of all completed thoughts would maybe the idea of the soul, or the idea of all causal relations in the world that we maybe observe would be the idea of the world, okay? And similar, the idea of the world and the soul together would be, according to Kant, the idea of God. So these are ideas. Technically, there are concepts of concepts, okay? But I pull that out from Kant. I don't know how much we can apply it to Hegel, but this may be a help to understand this here. So thus idea, and it alone is truth. Because the idea is, we say truth is one. And if there can be only one truth, and the idea is also thought in its totality, that means all thoughts taken together, then the idea is also one. So that means that since there can be just one, truth and idea must be the same. I hope this argument is clear. Now, I don't know what he means by implicitly and explicitly determined. It seems the thought is in accordance with its own laws of thinking, but also in accordance with the laws of nature that we empirically observe. So there's a kind of congruence that we want to achieve here. Yeah, and I maybe would put it in that sense. Now, it is essentially in the nature of the idea to develop, and only through development to arrive at comprehension of itself. Yeah, only if we develop ideas, we start understanding them, okay? Like there is no idea that is just put in your mind by God, or by your parents, or by biology. You have to develop them in order to understand them, or to become what it is. That the idea should have to make itself what it is seems like a contradiction. It may be said that it is what it is. Yeah, and here we find a new contradiction. So we introduce the idea of the idea, which is the idea of all thoughts taken together, determined as a totality internally and externally, implicitly and explicitly. But then we say that this oneness has to be developed, but it's one. How can it develop? And this is a contradiction, and we have to dive into this contradiction. So we hold fast. We have a contradiction that the idea is one, it's the truth, but that it still develops, and how do we deal with that? Okay, so we have said a lot today. I leave you some time to digest. What do you think about the idea of oneness? Do you think it's reasonable? Do you think it's unreasonable? Please let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this kind of lecture where I hope that we can discuss together, then please subscribe. Find me on my other channels. I would be very happy. Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, you know the spiel. Visit my blog. Give me a like. Everything that we need to support somebody on YouTube. If you like the content. If not, then also give me a like. For whatever. Because it's a contradiction and we read Hegel. Nevertheless, so I say live long, read Hegel, and prosper. Bye-bye.